When you see something evil happening and you have the ability to stop it, and you make the decision not to stop it, are you not being yourself evil? For example, if I were to be in a room with a bomb strapped onto a child, and I happen to be the only person either on Earth or within reasonable distance who knew how to disarm the bomb and therefore save the child's life. If I would make the decision to say, "Sorry, kid," and walk away to a safe distance, would I not be acting evil because I have neglected my responsibility to do good and to prevent suffering? It's pretty obvious that the answer to that question is that yes, I would be acting evil in that circumstance. But that brings up some other questions. It shows that there is a direct link between responsibility and power. You can't expect, for example, an infant child in that situation to be responsible and say that they are acting evil if they don't disarm the bomb because they couldn't have that particular knowledge. In my hypothetical situation here, I have a lot of power, and failing to use that power to prevent evil is in itself evil. At the risk of sounding like Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. But that brings up an interesting question about God. God is all-powerful. He is omnipotent. He has the ability to do whatever he desires, which means he has the ability to prevent evil. Therefore, is God himself either A, evil, B, he is not nearly as powerful as we thought him to be, or C, he just simply does not exist? That's what we're going to talk about on today's episode of The Gospel Call, brought to you by the Purcellville Church of Christ. The problem of evil, as it has been called, is the only logically valid argument against the existence of God. I choose that word valid very carefully. Valid is not the same thing as sound when we're talking about philosophical argumentation. An argument can be perfectly valid and still not sound, but an argument cannot be sound and still valid. In other words, somebody might be able to put an argument in proper syllogistic form, but that doesn't mean it's still correct. There's still the ability for things to be wrong, particularly in the premises. So, when we look at an argument like the problem of evil, if you were to put it in precisely stated syllogistic form, it would look something like this. A. If it is the case that there is an all-powerful, all-loving, and perfectly moral God, then that God would not allow evil to exist in the world. B. Evil exists in the world. C. Therefore, there is not an all-loving, all-powerful, and perfectly moral God. Now, I know this argument sounds a little bit different than the ones I set forth during the arguments for the existence of God. The arguments that I set forth earlier, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument, are all modus ponens arguments. Those are arguments that affirm the antecedent. So when you look at that first A statement, for example, remember our argument from cosmology. The A part went something like this. If it is the case that there is a contingent being in the universe, then there must be a non-contingent originator. Now, that was our A statement, and it was made of two parts. We call that the antecedent and the consequent. The antecedent was the part that started with, if it is the case. These statements always start with if, and then you have the then statement. So our if part was, if it is the case that there is a contingent being in the universe. That is our antecedent. Everything after that is the then statement. Then it must be the case that there is a non-contingent originator. That is the consequent. It shows the consequences of the first part. Now, while we are using deductive reasoning, there are two logically valid forms of argument that can be based around these types of statements. We call these the modus ponens and the modus tollens arguments. The modus ponens argument affirms the antecedent. That is, they say that the first statement is true. And so we follow the logic from there. If the first statement is accurate and it is true, then the rest of the logic, if put in modus ponens form, will always be correct. And so the rest of the argument that goes from our cosmological argument we were talking about before, the B part says it is the case that there is a contingent being in the universe. In fact, several. Do you see how that affirms the first part? And therefore, the conclusion is perfectly logical, which is that the C part, therefore, there is a non-contingent originator, is also going to be true. But that is not the only logically valid way of putting forth an argument. The modus tollens form of argumentation does not affirm the antecedent, it denies the consequent. So, if your B part is provably untrue, then it must also be true that your A part is untrue. So that's what type of argument we're looking at with the problem of evil. The A statement is going to say that if it is the case that a all-loving, all-powerful, and perfectly moral God exists, then evil would not exist. That's our A premise. Premise B, evil does exist. Do you see how that doesn't match the antecedent from before? And the C part, the conclusion, is going to logically follow from that. Therefore, there is not an all-powerful, all-loving, and moral God. So as we talk about this argument, we are not going to be attacking it on the basis of its logical validity, like we did with the Euthyphro dilemma, for example. Instead, we are going to be talking about premise A. Is it truly the case that if God is all-loving, all-powerful, and all-moral, that evil would not exist in the world? It certainly seems that way, doesn't it? Especially when we think about my hypothetical situation from the beginning, and we realize that the more power somebody has, the more responsibility they therefore have to prevent evil and suffering. So it would seem that God, being the most powerful being we could possibly imagine, should not allow any amount of suffering or evil on the world at all, but we obviously know that isn't the case. I certainly am not going to make the argument that we have all suffered equally. That certainly isn't true. Several of us have suffered more than others. And indeed, I myself come from a fairly blessed background where I have had to endure very little suffering compared to many people on the earth. I'm thankful for that. But I've still endured suffering. As part of the human experience, if you do not suffer, you have never lived. So why would God, being all-powerful, choose to allow us to suffer. We can go into all the great examples of human suffering that has happened over the ages. But honestly, I don't think that's necessary. I don't think I have to show you an illustration that something really bad has happened to people. I imagine that you already know that, and you know that from personal experience. Suffering is a part of life. So why does God not just simply use his almighty power as God to stop us from ever suffering? In order to solve this conundrum, I'd like us to look at the idea of omnipotence. Remember that omnipotence is all-powerful, is having the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want. Now, for those of you who are believers in God, this statement might sound surprising at first, but I hope as we talk about it, it starts to make a little more sense. There are certain things that even omnipotence, even God, cannot accomplish. God is all-powerful, but he cannot have power over the things which simply cannot have power over them, namely, the laws of logic. And you might think to yourself, well, wait a minute. If God is all-powerful, why is he bound by logic? Can he not himself be greater than logic? The answer is no. Not because God has a limitation of his power, but because logic is not a force to be overcome. It is simply an observation of what is. So, some of the classic gotcha questions regarding the existence of God actually have very simple answers. If somebody were to ask, can God create a rock that is so large that he himself cannot lift it? The answer is no, because God is still limited by the laws of logic. It doesn't make sense that he could do that. Can God make a being more powerful than himself? Again, the answer is emphatically no. God is not capable of doing things that are completely absurd and illogical. By the very definition, God is the Almighty and cannot create something bigger and more powerful than himself. And it seems weird to put a limitation on the power of God. But for you Christians out there, consider this. Have you ever got any impression from the Bible that God always gets what he wants? Did God want Adam and Eve to sin in the Garden of Eden? Certainly not. And yet, according to the Bible, they did anyway. So how was God not able to stop that from happening? The answer is God chose to give them free will. We have an inherent knowledge that we have free will. There are several philosophers who do believe that free will is an illusion. However, I'd like to point out that the statement itself is absurd. Just because we cannot do something that has no motivation, which is true, you cannot do anything without motivation, that doesn't mean that you weren't able to weigh the options in your head and choose for yourself what you thought best. That is free will. God was not able to stop Adam and Eve from sinning in the Garden of Eden because he gave them free will. You cannot simultaneously give somebody free will and then not allow them to do what they want. Oh, sure, you can put certain physical limitations upon it, But I suppose if you were to put a physical limitation on every single bad thing that they were to do, then no longer could they be considered to have true free will. God is not able to supersede the laws of logic. He was not able to simultaneously have Adam and Eve under his complete control and still give them free will. So, they sinned. And God had to allow it to happen. So we might think to ourselves, and why did God bother giving free will in the first place? If people were going to be able to commit evil because of their free will, why did God give us that ability, knowing that evil would come as a result? I think the answer is because good would come as a result as well. If you don't have free will, does love mean anything? If we are to love God, how could we do it if we didn't have the free will to choose for ourselves that yes, we love God? And if not, we don't really love Him. We are simply puppets. It's certainly no existence I would want to live in. Alright, so yes, there are some signs of physical evil that would happen because of free will. And we might even be able to see then how that evil will result in suffering as well. If somebody murders somebody, once again, for those of you who are Christians, think about the second sin. Well, second sin group anyway, recorded in the Bible, being Cain and Abel. Cain murdered Abel. Is murder possible if there is no suffering? Well, of course not. Cain exercised his free will to take the life of his brother. And by the way, I realize we haven't proven yet that the Bible is the Word of God, at least not in this podcast. So let's change the illustration to something we don't have to worry about just yet. If anybody kills somebody else, are they not exercising their own free will to do so? And therefore, if they could not do it, would they truly have free will? And we might say, sure, you have free will, you just can't do this. But then we would probably be taking away the ability to do the next worst thing if we were left in that position, would we not? We would be taking away rape, arson. We would be taking away all of the evils, the greatest evils of mankind. And then we would be left with what we might consider to be lesser evils. I don't think there's a lot of us out there who would honestly make the claim, for example, that theft is worse than murder. But if we didn't have those other evils, then theft, and that class of evil, for lack of a better term, would then become the new greatest class of evil, and what we would begin to demand be taken away. And then what would be left? No, evil has to exist, and its consequences have to be real. Well, what about the suffering that happens on earth that isn't the direct result of the hand of man? In fact, most suffering on earth doesn't happen as a direct result of man's action. I think a great illustration of this is casualties during the First World War. World War I was infamous for how bloody it was. But did you know that more people during the time span of World War I actually died of the Spanish flu instead of dying as a direct result of the war? People cause suffering and evil, yes, but why do the natural sufferings exist? Why do we have disease? At the time of recording this, we have been under lockdown because of the coronavirus. And this is being recorded on June 10th, so I would guess it's been about 3 months now. There are other natural sufferings, of course. Natural disaster, death. Why does it all happen? Here is the point where we do have to say we don't fully understand it, but we know it must be the case. This must be the case, that evil demands death. We understand that to a certain degree innately. We also understand the value of mercy. Please don't misunderstand me. But we also know that evil is deserving of death. One more time back to the Bible. In Romans chapter 6 and verse 23, the Bible reads, "The wages of sin is death." There is a law woven into the universe as unchangeable as that of logic, that God himself cannot change, and that is, sin is deserving of death. That's why we have suffering and pain and evil on the world. It's not because God is simply allowing it to happen. It's because we, when we have done evil, and if we look at ourselves honestly, and I certainly don't put myself above this, I consider myself greatest of the sinners, then we know that it's here because of our own responsibility. Now, God, being a benevolent and all-loving God, did prepare a place where there would be no more sin. Does that mean there's not going to be any free will in heaven? No. The Bible never says that no one can sin in heaven. It says no one will sin in heaven. There is a difference there. Free will can be exercised to always do the right thing, although none of us are going to do that here on earth. So if we go back to our original premise, if there is an all-loving, all-powerful, and perfectly moral God, then there would be no sin, suffering, and death. We find that the premise isn't actually true. In fact, when we talk about evil, we have implied the existence of God because we have affirmed objective morality. Therefore, the entire problem of evil is not sound. Valid, put in a nice syllogistic form that makes it look good, but it is not sound. We want to encourage you to write into us. I love getting emails. If you have any sort of question, comment, or clarification that you feel needs to be made to anything that is said here, please don't hesitate to write in at thegospelcallpodcast@gmail.com. That's thegospelcallpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. For the Purcellville Church of Christ, I'm DJ Kessinger. Thank you so much for listening.